I'm Shane Morris with the Coulson Center for Christian Worldview. Civil disagreement, or civility in discourse, seems a lofty goal in our angry and polarized public square. But as Christopher Love argues, it's a necessary ingredient to a well-ordered society. In this presentation given at St. George's Anglican Church in Colorado Springs, Love defines civil disagreement, presents a case for it from secular and theological perspectives, and provides strategies for engaging in civil discourse. Love is an active duty officer who teaches philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He writes on civil disagreement and related topics at civil-america.blog. He's also a Colson Fellow from the class of 2018 through 19. It's expressed here are solely his own and don't represent those of the U.S. Air Force Academy or the Department of Defense. During his presentation, Love mentions a handout he gave to the audience. We've got that for you in PDF form at breakpoint.org. Here's Christopher Love, as introduced by Sarah Stonestreet, wife of Coulson Center President John Stonestreet and the leader of the Colson Fellows cohort in Colorado Springs.
Chris Love teaches philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy and has a broad interest in ethics and public square. He has spent the last 3 years thinking and writing on the importance of civil disagreement through his master's thesis, subsequent articles, and his blog, civil-america.blog.wordpress.com. It's okay, I will link that in our follow-up email, don't you worry. Prior to his graduate studies, Chris served 5 years as a public affairs officer for the Air Force. And as I said, he goes to St. George's. And another interesting fact about Chris Love is that he is a commissioned Colson Fellows. Does that sound familiar? Coulson Fellows? Anything? Okay, because we've been promoting Coulson Fellows, and I just want you to see, wow, when you get to be a Coulson Fellow, you might be invited to speak at Devin Discourse. Maybe not. It depends. No, I'm just kidding. So, Chris, come on up.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that warm introduction. And thank you for leading our local Coulson Fellows program, which she didn't tell you that she does, but she gave us 10 months of her time, and it was a real gift. I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Lauren, my wife, for giving me 10 months to participate in that program, despite the fact that we have 4 kids, 6 and under. So that was a real gift. Thank you. Not something to be taken lightly. A recurring theme for the Coulson Fellows program, since we're on the topic, and one that really resonated with me, was the now what, the so what, you could say, of our salvation. This was something that seems to have captured Chuck Colson's heart and those who've succeeded him in that ministry. And a major contention that Chuck Colson had was that Christians live out their faith, at least one way in which we live out our faith, is to be God's instruments of common grace in the world. Restorers of all things, bringers of shalom. That word shalom is a powerful one. In their book, How Now Shall We Live, Chuck Colson and Nancy Piercy have this to say about it. Although popularly translated peace, the connotations of the term are actually much broader than the absence of hostilities. Shalom refers to peace in a positive sense, the result of a rightly ordered community. I am convinced that the practice of civil disagreement, or we'll just call it civility for short, that I'll be commending to you tonight, is one crucial ingredient of shalom. That where it is present, we are that much closer to a rightly ordered community. My task is to try and convince you of that, to flesh out what I take to be some of the crucial fruits of civil disagreement. I'm going to spend most of my time doing that, but we'll end with the last several minutes devoted to the question of, so how do we cultivate this thing if it indeed is as good as I'm trying to convince you that it is? My method is going to be to proceed in 2 directions. The first, and really the majority of the time, I'm going to be offering a secular case for civil disagreement. Though a Christian and though in a predominantly Christian audience, I don't think we have to restrict ourselves to a Christian defense of this virtue. I think it's readily intelligible to our neighbors, and that we are that much closer to experiencing it in our time if we can translate it in terms that everyone can understand. But I'll also offer a theological defense as well. And my hope is that I can reach people on both sides of this issue, both secular and theological. So welcome if this is sort of a new environment for you. Though I'm going to sometimes use some political examples. This is kind of the nature of the game. We're talking about contentious issues. I'm not trying to make a political statement, and nor I'm certainly not trying to suggest that incivility is a problem on one side of the political spectrum exclusively. I think it's a problem on every side. It's our problem, and we've got to figure out what to do with it. So then, what is this civility thing that I speak of? I've claimed that it is an ingredient of a rightly ordered community. Another way of putting that would be to say that civility is a virtue. Writing 2,400 years ago, Aristotle, who thought a lot about the virtues, had a general approach to defining virtues that I think is helpful for us tonight. You may be familiar with the idea of a golden mean, by which Aristotle meant essentially, well, not essentially, exactly, that a virtue is a mean or a kind of ideal balancing point between two vices. On the one hand, a vice of excess, and on the other hand, a vice of deficiency. And virtue lies at this ideal place between those things. And I think that's a helpful framework for approaching what I'm talking about tonight. What that implies is that in order to understand what civility is, we need to understand what it isn't. So let's start with that. What I don't mean by civility or civil disagreement is, on the one hand, mere niceness in the context of a debate. You could think of a wet noodle approach to disagreement where you're just flopping back and forth. You have no conviction. That's not what I'm promoting to you this evening. Some people are so concerned about the feelings of their interlocutor, and rightly so, that they compromise the truth when the going gets tough in the course of a disagreement. We could call this a sort of soft relativism. They may not actually endorse their interlocutor's views, but you have no idea if you were a fly on the wall based on the way the conversation plays out. I think you can have conviction and have a civil disagreement at the same time. But on the other hand, the far opposite extreme of that, some people are so unconcerned about their interlocutor that they trample over this person in an attempt to get at the truth. Perhaps that's more of a problem for us today. We could call this vicious disagreement. And I want to suggest that civility is neither of those things. It is that excellent or difficult or praiseworthy, as Aristotle would say, balance point between these extremes. If you're familiar with Christian apologetic circles, we could say that civility is disagreement that seeks both truth and love, and which refuses to compromise on either. One of my heroes is Francis Schaeffer, who has a book, biography, I think, written about him called Truth with Love. Civility is that, in a particular context, when we have a deep disagreement between us. The way that I tend to define it is as follows, and it's on your handout. Brief note about that handout. As my grandmother pointed out to me last night when I was practicing on her, it's not exhaustive. I just have some of the key points I want you to take away. Feel free to put other things down if you wish. So how have I defined it? We show civility toward others when we dispute their ideas in ways that respect those persons' intrinsic worth. It is, in other words, disagreement shaped by the worth of the other. Now, I just made a really controversial claim that we have this intrinsic worth, a worth that we have irrespective of the views that we hold. Not everyone, perhaps most people, don't share that claim. As a Christian, I think that I'm compelled to do so. I think the imago Dei is stamped on every person, and therefore we have to factor that in when we disagree with them. But if you don't share that conviction, hold on to your hats, that's okay. We're going to have to talk about it during the Q&A. One important thing about civility, and this is crucial to note, is it doesn't require us to like the other person's views. We can think that they're abominable, right? That's okay. What it does demand of us is that when we go to dispute those views, we do so in a way that keeps with the worth of the other. So that's what I'm commending to you. And now the huge question is, what makes it so commendable? What is commendable about civil disagreement? We can summarize the argument I'm going to be offering, both, incidentally, the secular argument and the theological argument, with a syllogism I've given you in your handout. And I'll just read it to you. Premise 1. If we want to increase our chances of achieving clarity and reconciliation today, we need to practice civil disagreement. Second premise, we want to increase those chances. And therefore, we need to practice civil disagreement. Some initial clarifications are in order. First, when I mention the we in this argument, I mean all of us. That's Christians and non-Christians alike. No one gets a pass. Second, when I talk about increase our chances, what I'm trying to say here is civility is not a panacea. It won't fix every problem. It won't guarantee that will get at clarity and reconciliation, but it will get us a whole lot closer than we would have otherwise. I thought of this analogy. Lauren, I haven't run it by you, so if it flops, it's my fault. But to bake a cake, right, you need flour, you need sugar. I mean, it's not the only essential ingredient. Steve's giving me the thumbs up. But that doesn't mean, just because it's not the only thing that matters, that it's not indispensable, or all but indispensable. That's how I view civility. We can imagine people, in other words, arriving at clarity and reconciliation without civil disagreement, but they're the exception, not the norm. You're not going to build a flourishing society off of the exception. You're going to build it off of kind of a broader thing that applies to most people. When I use the term today in the first premise, if we want to increase our chances of clarity and reconciliation today, what I have in mind specifically is modern pluralistic societies of the sort in which we live. So those are societies that have the following sorts of attributes. This isn't exhaustive, but this is important for us. Worldview diversity. So we have people living alongside, working alongside one another who happen to see the world in radically different ways. That's one feature of a modern pluralistic society. And along those worldview lines, we have intense polarization. Right? And then a third feature happens to be our 21st century communications technologies. If that seems weird to you, we'll get to it, but I think that that's a crucial element of what it means to live in a society like ours, one that's marked by, dependent on those sorts of communications technologies, for reasons we'll explain. And then finally, the terms clarity and reconciliation, we'll get to them, but they're in your handout. They're really important, so that's why I've got them there, and we will spend a lot of time on each one. My strategy is going to be to focus on the first premise. I want to make that as clear and compelling to you as possible. I think that in the process, the second premise will just become obvious. You'll see why clarity and reconciliation matter as much as they do, and then you'll want to increase our chances as much as you can. Okay, so the question then, what is it about civil disagreement that helps us arrive at clarity and reconciliation? And the beginning of my answer is this. It has to do with the relationship between civility and effective dialogue. Specifically, that civility invites and sustains dialogue, whereas incivility repels and undermines it. Civility invites and sustains dialogue, whereas incivility repels and undermines it. I take this to be a very common sense psychological point that you can test against your own lived experience. After all, it's a pretty bitter place out there on the street, so you've probably got experiences you can weigh this against, but let's do a little bit of a thought experiment. Recall a time when you were in conversation with someone, and the conversation centered on a topic that was very weighty in nature. A couple examples that matter for our public square. You could say the moral and biological status of the human fetus. That would be one. What do we do with our migrant crisis? That would be another. And you could fill in a million others. Not only was the topic centered on something weighty, but you had very strong views about it. And you wanted those views to get hearing, and a fair one. Now, when you went to make your point with your interlocutor, imagine or recall the following sorts of things happening to you. This person mocked you, or rolled his eyes, interrupted you at crucial turns, disregarded huge stretches of what you had to say, maybe in a moment of impassioned fury called you a bigot, or shouted you down, threatened violence, or acted on it. My question to you is, what effects did that sort of treatment have on the kind of dialogue that transpired? Did it increase your ability to think clearly, to formulate your thoughts well, to fairly evaluate your opponent's views and your own in light of your opponent's criticism? I would suggest that for most people, the answer is a resounding no. It did none of those things. In fact, it did the reverse of those things. If you're like most people, and I include myself in this list, you probably had one of two responses to that sort of uncivil treatment. On the one hand, you might just withdraw from the conversation, physically leave the space, which happens, or just mentally and emotionally check out. Might as well have tuned off, right? I'm not hearing what you have to say anymore. That's a common sort of response to incivility. But if you're like other people, and I know one or two of these characters in the room, I won't name them, you might grow really defensive. You might hold on to your views simply because they're yours, irrespective of any merits that they might have. Or you might denounce your opponent's views simply because they're theirs, even if they happen to have made some good points. But the crucial idea here is that in either case, notice what's happened. Clarity has gone out the window. In the one instance, it's because the conversation has literally stopped. There is no more exchange of ideas. There's no more possibility to clarify and sharpen our thoughts against one another. In the other case, it's because you've become epistemically compromised. You're no longer thinking in the right frame of mind to really pick fruit from that conversation. This, by the way, if you haven't been unfortunate enough to have one of these nasty encounters, it happens in other forums too. Maybe you were reading a book one day and you thought that, man, this author is just a total jerk, and you slammed the book shut and you never picked it up again. Well, that conversation just ended, didn't it? Or some television program or podcast you were listening to and you threw the remote across the room or whatever, right? This thing happens in a variety of forums. I want you to contrast that with a civil conversation, one in which, though your opponent disagrees with you, perhaps profoundly, he or she nevertheless approaches that disagreement in a way that says, you're still a person, you still matter, and even though I disagree with you, that fact has to feature in how I respond. It's not pleasant to have our treasured views critiqued, even if it's done nicely, you could say, civilly, but it's a whole lot of a different experience when that happens than the one that we spoke about formerly. So just to sum up where we've come from so far, civility promotes effective dialogue, which in turn has implications for clarity. I want to turn to that idea now. What do I mean by clarity? Why does it matter? On your handout, I have 3 things listed under the idea of clarity. Walk through each one. The first one is clarity about what our neighbors believe. It's often the case, I think, that we get this wrong today for reasons that we'll talk about. And when that happens, when we mistake what our neighbors actually believe about a given issue, this isn't inconsequential. There's a lot at stake here. When we get it really wrong, as we sometimes do, we slander these people in profound ways, don't we? We suggest that they're miserable characters or what have you, totally unreasonable. And it turns out we just misunderstood what it was that they believed in the first place. But a more practical point, that's more of a moral one. A practical one is that we waste a lot of time in our important political debates, confronting fictions, ghosts, beliefs that don't even exist, you could say. That would be another consequence of getting it wrong about C1, that is, about what our neighbors believe. But just as important as it is to understand what our neighbors believe in this diverse public square, I want to suggest that it's equally important to understand the why behind our neighbors' beliefs. And if I was in class right now, I would jump up and down and foot stomp and say, what I'm about to say is really important. I think this is probably one of the most important things I have to offer to you tonight. But it's this. It's the idea that 2 people, 3 people, however many, can on the surface agree about some proposition, whatever it is. But when you go beneath the surface, you find that they've arrived at that proposition in vastly different ways, and that those differences matter. They matter in the judgments about the character of those people. They matter in our judgments about their reasonableness, whether they even have a right to holding that belief in the first place. Give you a couple examples. One, I've become somewhat of an evangelist for this movie of late. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. 12 Angry Men. I think Henry Fonda, I think it's 1957. It's black and white, but it will change your world. This movie centers on a murder trial in New York City on a really hot summer night, much like this one, except much more muggy. You don't get the mugginess out here. And really, the whole thing takes place in one room, which was a total shocker to my students. The entire movie takes place in one room. Yeah, the scene doesn't really change. And it's about this jury as they're deliberating on whether or not this 18, 19-year-old boy from the slums murdered his father or not. And about halfway through the film, as the prevailing consensus has started to change from, at the first, this guy's definitely guilty, to maybe we have some reasonable doubts here. There's a character, I don't know his name, you don't learn the characters' names, and he changes his view. They go and they poll, they're trying to figure out where are we in this case, and he says, not guilty, whereas formerly he had been for guilty, and for the death penalty which would come with it. Now what's interesting about this scene is that this character is immediately confronted by someone else who has also changed his view not that long earlier, from a guilty to a not guilty. And the reason that he's confronted is this. It is evident to everyone there that the guy's just fed up with the trial. He's got tickets to a Yankees-Cleveland game. He wants to get the heck out of there. And his position, his reasons for changing his view are radically different than the others in that room, who genuinely believe that there is a reasonable doubt and you can't send someone to the electric chair because of a reasonable doubt. That's one example, right? We can hold what on the surface seems like the same position for radically different reasons, and those reasons matter. Let me give you another example. Several years ago, I saw a bumper sticker that I will never forget. I've never seen it again, but it's emblazoned in my mind. The image on the picture was the United States. This is the one detail that I can't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure that it was surrounded by barbed wire. Anyway, it was a fence of some sort. But what really mattered was on the picture, on the bumper sticker, were these words: "Stay the F out, we're full," except the F wasn't edited like I just gave to you. Couple things immediately struck me as I saw this bumper sticker. Obviously, it seemed to be some kind of strident message about the need for increased border security, immigration control. But what really struck me was that what seemed to be animating or motivating someone to put a bumper sticker like that on his car, or her car, I suppose, was at least a kind of callousness toward others, if not something stronger than that. You don't need those terms, "stay the F out, we're full," as a normal way of making your point. There's something going on, there's a heart issue there. But another reason that it struck me is I had just deployed for 6 months to Honduras, where I was with U.S. Southern Command, and because of the sorts of things that we were doing down there, was very aware of prudential reasons why someone might actually care about the porousness of our borders that have absolutely nothing to do with the color of someone's skin, the language they speak, the ideas they hold, whatever. Completely prudential in nature. And yet I thought to myself, anyone who sees this bumper sticker is going to conclude, as indeed many people in our contemporary conversation have, that the only way someone arrives at "we need greater border security" is because of animus toward other people. How devastating and sad that is. We have on the surface the same position, but arrived at via radically different reasons, and those reasons matter. The implication here is if I get it wrong, if I misrepresent your reasons, then I've defamed your character, perhaps in profound ways. So this is a weighty idea. Okay, third form of clarity. What is in fact the case? So we've all got our views, whatever those views happen to be. Well, what's the truth of the matter? Who's right? Who's wrong? Now, this is important because we form our judgments, we enact our policies, what have you, in community with one another through a deliberative process. At least that's how it's supposed to work. And if that process has been radically compromised because it's infected with incivility, the results of that process are also likely to be compromised, whether at the local, county, state, national, international level. We could, sometimes perhaps we do, enact policies or form judgments that are harmful, that are destined to fail, that will wreak havoc in people's lives because our thought process has been compromised by an uncivil deliberation. John, Sarah's husband, famously uses the following words as part of his regular ministry: ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. And if we have a system that generates a lot of bad ideas because we can't sharpen our ideas off of one another, it's too painful, things break down too quickly, that's going to have serious consequences in the lives of real human beings. Okay, so I hope to have suggested that these forms of clarity, C1 through C3, matter in and of themselves. And I think they do, but also I think that they matter because of something else. They're a means toward the greater end, the greater good of reconciliation. So I'm going to move to that, but just briefly summarize where we've come from so far. I want to suggest to you that civil disagreement promotes effective dialogue, which promotes clarity of the sort that we've discussed, which in turn promotes reconciliation. So what do we mean by that? I mean, actually several things by that. I'm going to address them in turn, and you can imagine in your mind they're going from maybe the most obvious kind to the least obvious kind, but I want to suggest all of them matter. Okay, the first kind, which I've entitled R1. Sometimes we might simply discover, as the result of a clarifying, effective dialogue, that we don't actually disagree after all. This might strike you as a weird thing. How often does that ever happen, right? Well, I think it can happen, and maybe for a couple reasons. One would be that because we are in our different communities, our different ghettos even, sometimes we use We have our own sort of language, our own lingo for talking about things. And it might just be the case that we're talking about the same thing as that person across the aisle or across the trench. We just don't know it because we're using that different language. I sometimes think, I might get some glares, I don't know, but I sometimes think that historic disagreements between Catholics and Protestants could fall in this camp. We're using different terms because we've been separated for 500 years. Maybe there's more to be said than that. I don't want to oversimplify. Another way, though, in which we can have a kind of faux disagreement, we can think that we disagree when we don't, in fact, and I think this is much commoner the case, is when we form our judgments based off of hearsay. We go to a third party rather than straight to the source. I'm going to give you an example of that. You may remember from a couple years ago an incident at Middlebury College, which is close to where I grew up in Vermont. I grew up in upstate New York, but they're right across the way. This particular incident was a protest gone awry. The source of the protest was that the conservative speaker, Dr. Charles Murray, was invited to speak at Middlebury. And who invited him was a self-professing liberal professor, Dr. Allison Stranger, who by the time that this protest gone awry was over, had received whiplash from having her hair tugged by a mob and a concussion, and she spent the next week in a dark room recovering from this event, which gave her a lot of time to think about a New York Times op-ed, which she went on to write. And in that op-ed, she had this to say, which makes the point that I'm talking about. This past month, as the campus uproar about Dr. Murray's visit built, I was genuinely surprised and troubled to learn that some of my faculty colleagues had rendered judgments on Dr. Murray's work and character without ever having read anything he has written. It wasn't just students, some professors protested his appearance as well. Intelligent members of the Middlebury community, and it's one of the best schools in the country, including some of my own students and advisees, concluded that Charles Murray was an anti-gay, white nationalist from what they were hearing from one another and what they read on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. Never mind that Dr. Murray supports same-sex marriage and is a member of the courageous Never Trump wing of the Republican Party. She goes on to summarize by saying, faulty information became the catalyst for shutting off the free exchange of ideas at Middlebury. So this happens, and sometimes it has profound consequences of the sort that I just described. But it's probably not the common case. Probably we genuinely do have a disagreement. It's not a faux disagreement, it's not a mistake. So let's move on to the second kind, which I've called R2 on your handout. This is instances when, because of our clarifying civil disagreement, you are persuaded, or I am persuaded to join your side. We had a disagreement, and we no longer do. We've walked across the bridge and joined the other party. You might think, and you probably do think if you watch the news much, does that ever happen today? But it does, actually, and not just on isolated beliefs, kind of micro beliefs, but on big whole-of-life issues, worldview transformations. This sort of thing happens. Anytime we hear a famous conversion story, some of my favorites are C.S. Lewis's conversion from atheism to committed Christian belief. Anthony Flew, who never quite made it to Christianity, but had been a world-renowned atheist philosopher and huge proponent of David Hume's thinking, and who came to a kind of deism shortly before he died and wrote a book about it. One of my real heroes, Nabil Qureshi, whose work, if you haven't encountered, you need to. As a result of a 4-year-long friendship in college, Nabil, who had grown up in a very sincerely and patriotic Muslim home, converted to Christianity through intense deliberation and dialogue, many late-night college encounters. His story is a really profound one. I chose my favorite, you can think of yours. But the point is that these sorts of things happen, and they happen on a big level, not just a tiny level. But you might be thinking, surely even this is not the common case, persuasion. Often there's something short of that. And I grant you, there is. There's two things at least that I think are a tremendous import for us tonight. The first, which I've called R3, is maybe a little bit less clear at first, but maybe one of the more important kinds. It is as follows, that we continue to disagree, but you learn something, or I learned something about you, right? About my reasons or my background commitments that cast my position in a more favorable light. If this seems unclear, let's explore it a little bit. Remember, I said that the why can matter just as much as the what. We spent a lot of time talking about the why behind the what. So suppose that I assumed that your why, for whatever it was X. And then I come to learn that you vehemently reject X, that your why is a Y and a Z, or whatever. That can make a profound difference. We can't undervalue this form of reconciliation. I'll say autobiographically here that my hope for our generation, our period in time, and much of what drove me to this project in the first place, was that we can transform the myriad debates surrounding human sexuality and identity along these sorts of lines. That is my desperate hope. My family is invested in this project. Those of you who attend St. George's understand that. How could our myriad debates about human sexuality and identity transform in the way of R3? Well, contrary to common belief, many of these debates are not as simple love versus hate, celebrate or you're a bigot kind of affair. I would suggest to you that in many cases, certainly not all, I'm not trying to oversimplify things, but in many cases, what is really going on is a principled, goodwill disagreement about worldview propositions, sources of human flourishing. Some of these propositions include the following sort. What is our nature? We have radical disagreement today about what our human nature consists in. Who knows best about the good life? Huge implications at stake, depending on how we answer that question. Am I radically autonomous? Or do I belong to someone to whom I have duties, and who knows and loves me better than I know and love myself? Depending on how we answer these sorts of questions, it's going to profoundly shape how we approach and evaluate all the LGBTQ issues, right? What I was going to do was read to you an excerpt from a book that we read in the Coulson Fellow's program. It's called People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue, by the PhD and pastor Preston Sprinkle. But I decided that possibly a more effective way of making this point would just be to quote some of the names of people in this debate who are themselves LGBTQ identifying, and yet who've chosen not to act on their desires precisely because of how they answer these sorts of worldview questions. So these are just some names that came to mind today. Christopher Yuan is one that you'll get to know intimately if you're a Coulson Fellow. Wesley Hill, whose book Washed in Waiting is a profound testimony of the struggle of what it's like to live out his Christian convictions while never losing that intense desire for someone of the same sex. Sam Albury, who's an Anglican minister in England and probably one of my wife's big heroes, so I'd be remiss not to mention him. Also someone who has never lost his desire for the opposite sex. Rosaria Butterfield, former English professor at Syracuse University, open lesbian living with another woman for many years. Jackie Hill Perry, who just appeared at the Wilberforce Weekend in Washington, D.C. Walt Heyer, a former transgender woman. I'm not sure how you use that term, but originally a man, back to being a man, who writes about this. Sam Parrish, a friend that I met at a former assignment, and Doug Mainwaring, who often writes in the public discourse. All of these figures, and you can find more of them, are self-identifying LGBTQ people who have chosen, because of their worldview commitments, not to live out that lifestyle, and often at great personal sacrifice. But what's important to note here is that it would be absurd in their cases to say that what's motivating their position is sheer animus, right? That's not the case. Many of them are still identifying in these ways. They don't hate themselves, and they certainly don't hate other people who are struggling in these ways. A lot of them have ministries in which they are radically committed to trying to reach people who identify as the LGBT, the B, the G, the T, or the Q. And that makes a profound difference. It's very different for them to hold the view that they do versus somebody who simply feels uncomfortable around gay people, or who gets a kind of kick out of mistreating others, like the proverbial neighborhood bully. These people are not in the same place. And to the extent that we can identify goodwill among them, then we can learn to live alongside them, not as enemies, but as people with whom we merely disagree. And I think we have to find ways to do that today.
Shane Morris here again. I hope you're enjoying Christopher Love's presentation on civil disagreement. We'll get back to him in just a minute. But first, I wanted to let you know that during the month of September, the Coulson Center is offering a great new book by Os Guinness. His new book is Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times. Os Guinness is one of the leading Christian thinkers of our time, and he's been a longtime friend of the Coulson Center. His latest book won't be available to the public for several more weeks, but it's available to Coulson Center supporters now. It's a call for Christians to live consequential lives in a harried and distracted world. Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times is available at breakpoint.org with any donation you make to Breakpoint and the Coulson Center. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Now, back to Christopher Love.
And then the final form of reconciliation, and maybe some of you cynics out there are like, yeah, this is the only form of reconciliation, but it's when the person you're dealing with really is motivated by animus, maybe. They will not change their mind. They're being unreasonable, whatever. You can't reach them. But the result of a civil disagreement with them might still lend a kind of clarity that enables you to reach somebody else. The ones that you care about. Your son or your daughter, your parents, your dear friends in the public square. The example that came to mind here earlier today was, I don't know that anyone will ever reach Richard Dawkins, but there's a lot of people who read his books. And if you could get clarity on why Dawkins believes what he does, you might at least win them. So that's an example. You find one that resonates with you. But you learn something about my position that enables you to better counter it in the public square. That matters, because people matter. Okay, I hope that in the process of sketching how civility promotes clarity and reconciliation, what has happened simultaneously is that it's furthered your appreciation for those things. You've come to view them as precious, such that if there was a way of getting at them, you would want to do it. But in addition to saying that they're precious, I want to also argue that they're imperiled. They're a kind of endangered species. And I'm not going to focus on the reconciliation because that's obvious if you live in our present cultural moment. I want to focus on the clarity piece, which I think is fascinating. And we could easily do another downtown discourse just on this topic. What are some of the challenges to clarity that we're facing today? To getting a clear view of what our neighbors really believe and why and what is in fact the case? I think there's several. One just is that pluralism that we've been talking about. When you view the world in a way radically different than your neighbor, you are likely to make all sorts of false assumptions about what your neighbors really believe and why, right? You just can't imagine what it's like to be in their shoes. But it gets worse when things get as polarized as they are at present, because we don't want to talk with each other. We want to withdraw into our comfortable ghettos because it's really uncomfortable out there where the friction points are happening. That's just a cesspool, waiting to promote misunderstanding and the lack of clarity. But here's an interesting one. Another source of unclarity, to use that kind of crude term, would be that the world is complex. I could say God's world is complex, and yet we like to simplify it, don't we? We don't like complexity. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us work hard to get at it. Aristotle, again, we're going to keep coming back to this guy, he was really smart, said that the many are not the sort to make distinctions. And I don't think that things have changed in the 2,400 years since he wrote those words. Sometimes, though, we have to make distinctions. Sometimes there is a night and day difference when we can make distinctions or when we don't make distinctions. I'm going to give you an example here that I came across somewhat recently from Erich Metaxas' biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer being a famous Protestant pastor in Germany who was sent to a death camp because he participated in the plot to try and kill Hitler. Metaxas has this to say: at the beginning of the war, it was possible to separate the Nazis from the Germans and recognize that not all Germans were Nazis. As the clash between the two nations wore on and more English fathers and sons and brothers died, distinguishing the difference became more difficult. Eventually, the difference vanished altogether. Realizing he needed to fuel the British war effort, Prime Minister Winston Churchill fused the Germans and the Nazis into a single hated enemy, the better to defeat it swiftly and end the unrelenting nightmare. When Germans working to defeat Hitler and the Nazis, people like Bonhoeffer, contacted Churchill and the British government, hoping for assistance to defeat their common enemy from the inside, hoping to tell the world that some Germans trapped inside the Reich felt much as they did, they were rebuffed. No one was interested in their overtures. It was too late. For the purposes of the war effort, Churchill maintained the fiction that there were no good Germans. It would even be said that the only good German, if one needed to use the phrase, was a dead German. That lack of nuance was also part of the hellishness of war. So here's a real life example of where our inability to make distinctions, to treat the world, the complicated world we live in, with the proper nuance that it demands. I mean, it'd be an interesting thing. Ask God one day, how many lives resulted because of this inability to appreciate nuance? Had they succeeded in taking out Hitler 2-3 years beforehand, how many people could have been spared if only we could appreciate nuance? It's not as if that problem has gone away, the complexity of the world and our desire to simplify it. We're faced with all sorts of oversimplifications and false dichotomies today. Just here's a couple examples. These resonate with me. Choose your own if they don't resonate with you. You're for progress or you're not. Never mind that progress implies a standard, that standards are worldview dependent. There's a lot of worldview options out there. Which should we use to evaluate progress? Either you're for abortion or you're against women's health. You can't be, against abortion and for women's health. The conversation today doesn't allow it. You're scientifically minded or you're biblically minded. You embrace reason or you embrace faith. You can't have both. You celebrate or you're a bigot. These are just some of the examples. We need more nuance in the conversation today. And the fourth and final thing that complicates our ability to get clarity is simply the pace and the structure of our modern life. We live in this frenetic, crazy busy world. We don't have a lot of time to research, to dig deep. And when we do go to do so, we have means of communication at our disposal that don't lend themselves easily to the task. What do I mean by that? I mean, really, how much detail can you pack into a tweet? Into a soundbite, a headline, a bumper sticker, a billboard? Not enough to appreciate the nuances of this complicated world. Right? And it's not just that our communications media don't allow us to get at those nuances, but they actually condition us to see the world in an unnuanced kind of way. One of my favorite books is by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a tough read, but it's a profound read. And Postman's entire book is devoted to the way in which our communications media transform our experience of the world, so we start to think in those same lines. I'm going to read you just one quote. We could read so many. And it's in it, Postman is taking the words of a former co-news anchor and an executive editor of a famous, used-to-be television show. And this co-news anchor, who knows what he's talking about, or is at the top of his game, has this to say about his medium. The idea, he writes, is to keep everything brief, not to strain the attention of anyone, but instead to provide constant stimulation through variety, novelty, action, and movement. You are required to pay attention to no concept, no character, and no problem for more than a few seconds at a time. He goes on to say that the assumptions controlling a news show are that bite-sized is best, that complexity must be avoided, that nuances are dispensable, that qualifications impede the simple message, that visual stimulation is a substitute for thought, and that verbal precision is an anachronism. He's writing this about television, but have things changed in the media, subsequent to television? Does, do our social media platforms or what have you, take your pick, do they lend themselves to the kind of clarity and nuance that we need, or do they promote a simplistic view of the world?
Made it worse.
So the point here is that we've got lots of reasons to think we might be getting it wrong in the areas of clarity. Clarity about what our neighbors believe, why they believe it, and what is in fact the case. And therefore, we need to conduct our conversations in ways that help us overcome those challenges. We need to bring civility into those conversations. So thus far, I've given you a secular defense of this virtue. I'm going to briefly offer a theological one. It's drawing upon the same basic points. It's probably too short for our purposes, but we'll get to the Q&A that much faster. So 3 things that I want to pull upon here. First, clarity refers to our ability to access the truth. And Christians should care about truth. All truth is God's truth, we believe. We want to know the things of God. We want to sing his praises as we uncover the mystery and the majesty of his creation. Even more than that, though, we believe that Jesus is the truth in an ultimate sense. He is the answer to whose we are, why we are, what the good life consists in, and we want our neighbors to appreciate that truth and to give the case for it a fair hearing before they make up their minds. And if we want them to give that case a fair hearing, we need to present it in a way that it can be received fairly, of the sort that we've just been talking about. We need to invite them into a thoughtful, deliberative evaluation and not scare them away by incivility. But not only that, but Scripture suggests that one of the ways that our neighbors come to know the truth of the faith is when we show love to them. That love in some almost mysterious way is an apologetic in and of its own. And civility just is love in a particular context, the context of a deep dispute with our neighbors. So when we show civility in the face of that kind of hostility that characterizes today, we are giving them a powerful apologetic. We should care about it. Secondly, Christians should care about reconciliation. Now, we've got some selfish reasons to care about it. We've got a stake in the game. The tolerance for dissent to the prevailing orthodoxies is quickly disappearing. And I would suggest that much of that growing intolerance is based on misunderstanding. Not all of it, to be sure, but much of it. That's been my contention earlier. We need clarity to show our neighbors that we really can love them and disagree with them simultaneously. But less selfishly, we should care about reconciliation because we're called to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount. Because we're called to a ministry of reconciliation, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5. Reconciling our neighbors to God and to one another. That's our role. That's something we get to do. And we should care about reconciliation because of who our neighbors are. People made in God's image, people for whom Christ died. That matters. We can't just erase that fact when it becomes inconvenient. Third, whether or not our civility brings about clarity or reconciliation, we need to care about it simply because we're called to love our neighbors, irrespective of the means or the goods that brings about. Love them to the point of a cross if it calls for it. Okay, again, too short. Maybe we can unpack this more in the Q&A. But that raises the big question. If civility matters so much from a secular standpoint and a theological standpoint, what do we do to cultivate it today? A few brief thoughts. The answer that I would suggest to you is that the task of cultivating civility begins with us. We need to be the exemplars. We can't wait around for other people to get this idea. If you're a Christian in the room, I just offered you a powerful, I think, twofold reason to care about this virtue. We have more reason to care about it because of that theological component than others do. So we need to practice it. And as I was talking with my grandmother last night, it does seem like the task can be really hopeless, really depressing. Really, can we transform the present state of our culture? But we shouldn't lose heart because there are really heartening examples from history. One of our heroes in the Colson Fellow's program is William Wilberforce, who 200 years ago set about the reformation of manners in England, which turned out to be something like the Victorian era. A huge shift from the ideas and practices that had preceded it, if you know anything about British history. There are instances in which God has done this sort of thing. He can do it again. Let's take heart. But what specifically can we do? Let me offer 5 suggestions. First, faced with our next disagreement, stop and let us ask ourselves, do I want clarity out of this exchange? Do I want a chance at reconciling with my neighbor? Because it's going to get a heck of a lot harder if I don't approach this civilly. With whom am I disagreeing? Maybe that should be enough for us, right? In other words, an understanding of why civility matters translates directly into tools that will help us be civil if we just ask ourselves those questions. Second, we need to practice it. We don't want to do one-off instances of civility like fireworks that are there and then they're gone. We want to be disposed toward being civil when we're squeezed. And the only way we're going to get there is by practicing it. All dispositions grow with practice. So where do we practice it? We could start in the home, for one. I think we should view our homes as training grounds of civility. If you still have children in the house, why not use the dinner table as an opportunity to inculcate that virtue? Or friends, if you're single, gather around the meal table and lovingly, thoughtfully, tactfully go into these conversations with an attempt to cultivate that practice. But not just in the home, also in the classroom. This is one that I care about. I think that every time you go to write an essay, all the reading that's required, all the thought before you put your words to paper, and then as you're putting your words to paper, that can be an exercise in civil disagreement. Even with an old dead white guy, if it comes down to it, you can be civil. In fact, there's a profound book, wittily titled How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. It's a classic. It's awesome. several chapters are devoted to this very thing. Can you approach the reading process and the evaluation that comes from it in a civil and constructive manner? They'll teach you how to do that. Also, in addition to needing to practice it and what we've already talked about, the third thing is that we don't rely on our own strength, right? We don't just set out and pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We should pray that God would help us to develop this virtue. If we've placed our trust in Christ and the Holy Spirit is at work in us, causing us to bear fruit, this can be the outworking of that. We hear in Galatians that the fruit of the Spirit is this: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You need a lot of those things in order to be civil in the sorts of disagreements that we have today. Civility is a fruit of the Spirit, and God can help us to cultivate it. Fourth, we need to be really wary of whom we're allowing to influence us today. And I say this because incivility is lucrative. It's lucrative because there's something wrong with us. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn would say, the line separating good and evil goes through every human heart. In the same way that we like to laugh sometimes at racist jokes, we like to laugh when our opponents are derided in the public square. We get a kind of kick out of that sometimes. If we're not careful, you'll notice it in yourself the next time it happens. And people pick up on this, and that's probably part of why talk shows and other things take on the character that they do. It's a kind of entertainment, isn't it? Recently, I was having a conversation with a well-respected female lawyer who works as a kind of political commentator sometimes. And because of her role and her background, she's been invited on a very premier political commentary show. I'm not going to tell you the name of it because I want to respect the privacy of that conversation. But if I told you this person's name, you'd know instantly who I'm talking about. And she was saying about it, man, this guy's got such good ideas. Ideas that could really make a difference out there. And you know what? His opponents are never going to give him a hearing because he's so vitriolic in how he speaks about them. And I thought to myself, what if this woman could appeal to her friend and persuade him that he needs to change the manner of his approach to disagreement, to invite them into the conversation? And then I thought, why couldn't all of us do that? I mean, we talk constantly about writing our congresspeople or whatever. Why can't we write those people that we look up to as thought leaders, but who need a little nudge, a little bit of help in the area of civility, and encourage them to make that change? I think we can do that. The point here is that rather than just letting them influence us, we should seek thoughtfully in the ways that we can to influence them for the better, to change the nature of that public conversation. And the fifth and final thing here, the case for civility is one that we can share. I've tried to make it accessible tonight. You should have an audio recording of tonight's lecture. There's a handout in front of you. I welcome you to visit the blog in which I've tried to put these ideas in a consolidated forum or correspond in the future. But it's one we can share, and that should be an encouraging thing. I began by quoting Chuck Colson and Nancy Pearcey, who argued that Christians should be bringers of shalom. And then I suggested to you that the practice of civil disagreement is one ingredient of shalom, one ingredient of a flourishing society. I hope to have shown you how specifically that works now. What are the concrete fruits of civil disagreement, both theologically and in a secular lens? And I hope, though, that you will walk away not just with an appreciation of those things, but with an excitement, with a willingness, with an eagerness to, with God's help, go out and cultivate civility in our time. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. Please come to breakpoint.org for the first 2 articles written by Professor Christopher Love. His topic, the importance of making distinctions in public discourse. Be sure to join us again on Wednesday for part 3 of our special series by Britt Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson, entitled Doing the Right Thing, an Exploration of Ethics. For the Coulson Center, I'm Shane Morris.